When my wealthy wife refused to call an ambulance for my dying father because it would ruin her dinner party, she thought I was just a broke, weak husband. She made me carry him out the back door like trash. But what she didn't know was that my father wasn't a poor antique dealer. He secretly controlled a $15 billion empire. And the moment he passed away, I didn't just plan his funeral. I planned her absolute, terrifying ruin. Make sure to watch until the very end to see exactly how justice is served. But before we dive in, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Also, drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. I absolutely love seeing where in the world my viewers are tuning in from. Now, let's get into the story. The clinking of imported crystal and the low, polished hum of old money echoed through the Kensington estate. Underneath the glow of a massive, tiered chandelier, 30 of the city's most elite figures dined on porcelain plates, draped in diamonds and quiet arrogance. And sitting at the far end of the sprawling mahogany table, swallowed by the suffocating atmosphere of wealth, was Elias Vance and his 80-year-old father, Silas. They did not belong here. Clara, Elias's wife, had made that abundantly clear before the first course was even served. She sat beside her mother at the head of the table, sipping a vintage red wine, occasionally shooting glances of pure disdain at her husband and his father. Elias wore a simple, off-the-rack navy suit. Silas wore his Sunday best, a faded gray coat with slightly frayed cuffs. To the Kensingtons, they were not family. They were a charity case, an unfortunate blemish on an otherwise perfect evening. Clara's mother, Evelyn, leaned across the table, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Tell me, Silas," she purred, loud enough for the neighboring guests to hear. "Does that quaint little antique shop of yours still have its roof, or did the winter storms finally put it out of its misery?" A ripple of polite, mocking laughter swept through the guests. Clara smiled, swirling her wine, not even glancing at her husband. Elias's jaw tightened. He reached under the table, placing a protective hand over his father's knee, ready to defend him. But Silas just offered a gentle, tired smile, absorbing the humiliation to keep the peace for his son's sake. Then, the fragile peace shattered. Silas's breath suddenly hitched. His trembling hand knocked against his water glass, sending it spilling across the pristine linen tablecloth. The heavy silver fork slipped from his grip, clattering loudly against his plate. The sharp noise cut through the polite conversations like a gunshot. Silas slumped forward, his face turning an alarming, ashen shade of gray as his hands clawed desperately at his chest. Elias sprang to his feet, his heavy oak chair scraping violently against the marble floor. He dropped to his knees beside the old man, grasping his shoulders. Dad, look at me. Breathe." Elias's voice was laced with rising terror. He whipped his head toward the room, his eyes frantic. "Someone call an ambulance. Now!" But no one moved. The guests simply stared, their faces twisted in mild distaste, as if a stray dog had wandered into their dining room. Clara stood up. She did not rush to her husband's side. She did not reach for her phone. Instead, she smoothed the front of her designer gown and stepped forward, her eyes flashing with absolute fury. She leaned down, her face inches from Elias's, her voice a harsh, venomous whisper that carried only to his ears. "Elias, stop this immediately. You are making a scene." Elias stared up at the woman he had married, his mind struggling to process her words. "Clara, he's having a heart attack. Call 911. Clara's expression did not soften. It turned to stone. She grabbed his wrist, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his skin, forcing his hand down. "Absolutely not," she hissed. "The mayor is sitting 3 seats away. You will not have paramedics storming through my mother's foyer with stretchers and sirens, ruining this evening. Drag the old man out the back door and take him yourself." The words hit Elias like a physical blow. The air in his lungs vanished. He looked up at Clara's parents, who were already motioning for the waitstaff to clear the spilled water, completely unbothered by the dying man at their feet. They were waiting for the trash to be taken out. In that agonizing, suspended moment, a cold realization settled into Elias's bones. He looked down at his father, frail and gasping for air, and then up at the glittering chandelier and the cold, lifeless eyes of his wife. Without another word, Elias slid his arms under his father. With a strength born of pure desperation and profound heartbreak, he lifted the old man against his chest. He turned his back on the dining room, walking past the staring eyes of the city's elite, carrying his father toward the servants' exit. As the heavy oak doors of the kitchen swung shut behind them, Elias heard the unmistakable sound of crystal glasses clinking together again, followed by Clara's light, practiced laughter as she seamlessly returned the party to its perfect, undisturbed ambience. The harsh, sterile hum of fluorescent lights replaced the warm, golden glow of the crystal chandelier. The hospital waiting room smelled of industrial bleach and stale coffee, a stark, unforgiving contrast to the expensive perfumes of the dinner party. Elias sat alone on a hard plastic chair, his hands clasped so tightly together that his knuckles were bone-white. He stared blankly at the scuffed linoleum floor. The doctor had delivered the news 20 minutes ago. His words had been quiet, practiced, and devastatingly final. Silas was gone. The heart failure had been massive, and the critical delay in getting him medical attention had sealed his fate. Elias felt completely hollowed out, as if the air had been permanently drawn from his lungs. He had no tears left, only a cold, heavy numbness that anchored him to the unforgiving chair. It was nearly 3 a.m. when the heavy double doors of the ward finally swung open. Clara walked in. She had not rushed. She still wore her elegant designer gown, and she moved with the slow, careless grace of someone who had stayed to enjoy the very last drop of champagne. She had not come alone. Shadowing her steps was Preston Croft. Preston was a wealthy, arrogant fixture in the Kensington's elite social circle, a man who wore custom Italian suits and carried a perpetual, knowing smirk. As Clara approached, Elias caught the unmistakable, heavy stench of vintage wine clinging to her breath. She had been drinking, laughing, and celebrating while his father was taking his final breaths. A passing nurse glanced in their direction, and Clara instantly shifted into character. She let out a soft, dramatic sigh, resting a perfectly manicured hand gently on Elias's shoulder. She dabbed at completely dry eyes with a tissue, murmuring about what a sudden, devastating tragedy this was, making absolutely sure the hospital staff witnessed a devoted, grieving wife. But the very second the nurse turned the corner and disappeared down the hall, the performance evaporated. Clara snatched her hand away from Elias as if his jacket had burned her. Her posture straightened, and the fragile mask of sympathy was instantly replaced by cold, hard irritation. She looked down at him, her voice dropping into a harsh, transactional whisper. "So it is over then. He is actually gone." Elias slowly lifted his head, his red-rimmed eyes searching his wife's face for even a fraction of humanity. He found absolutely none. "Do not look at me like that, Elias," Clara snapped, crossing her arms defensively. "Let's be perfectly honest for once. He was a burden, a financial and social anchor dragging us down for years. Now that he has finally passed, we need to handle this practically. I am not letting my parents pay a single dime for a funeral, and we certainly are not going into debt over it. Tomorrow morning, you're going to put that dusty, pathetic antique shop on the market. Sell the junk inside for scrap. Sell the land. I do not care. We will use whatever pennies it brings to put him in the ground and be done with this embarrassment." Elias's jaw tightened. The disrespect was a physical weight crushing his chest, but he was too shattered, too exhausted to scream. He simply stared past her, looking at the empty hospital corridor, feeling more isolated than he ever had in his entire life. Behind Clara, Preston Croft casually adjusted his expensive cufflinks. He did not offer a single word of condolence. Instead, Clara subtly shifted her weight and glanced back at Preston. For a fraction of a second, a silent, deeply intimate look passed between them. It was a dark look of shared victory, a poisonous understanding of a secret plan already in motion. Elias, consumed by the crushing weight of his newly orphaned reality, never saw the exchange. He sat completely alone in the freezing room, unaware that the true betrayal had only just begun. The bell above the heavy glass door chimed a dull, familiar note as Elias stepped out of the biting morning cold and into the sanctuary of his father's antique shop. The air inside was thick with the comforting scent of beeswax, old paper, and polished mahogany. It was a cluttered, narrow space, packed floor to ceiling with forgotten relics, ticking grandfather clocks and tarnished silver. Clara had always loathed this place, calling it a graveyard for worthless junk. To Elias, it was the only piece of his father he had left. Behind the scarred wooden counter stood Mr. Harrison, the quiet, stooped elderly assistant who had worked alongside Silas for as long as Elias could remember. He was polishing a brass compass, his movements slow and methodical. He offered Elias a look of profound, silent sympathy, requiring no words to acknowledge the tragedy of the previous night. The quiet morning was abruptly shattered by the shrill, demanding ring of Elias's cell phone. The caller ID flashed Clara's name. Elias hesitated, his thumb hovering over the screen, before finally pressing answer. He did not even get the chance to speak. Clara's voice tore through the earpiece, loud and acidic. "Tell me you are already boxing up that garbage," she demanded, her tone devoid of any lingering pretense. "I spoke to a commercial realtor this morning. They said the land is worth a fraction of what I thought. But if we demolish the building and sell the inventory for scrap, we might cover the burial without me having to dip into my accounts. Do not drag your feet on this. Elias, sign the listing agreement today." Elias listened to the venom in her voice, looking around the beautiful, quiet history his father had carefully curated. A new, unfamiliar hardened resolve sparked in his chest. Without uttering a single syllable, Elias pulled the phone away from his ear and pressed end. Mr. Harrison stopped polishing the compass. He set the brass instrument down on the counter with a soft, deliberate click. The hunched, fragile posture of the elderly clerk seemed to instantly evaporate, replaced by an iron-straight spine and a gaze of piercing intensity. He walked past the counter, turned the brass lock on the front door, and flipped the sign to close. "It is time, Elias," Mr. Harrison said, his voice stripped of its usual raspy frailty, now resonating with crisp, commanding authority. Elias frowned, confusion pushing through his grief. "Time for what, Mr. Harrison?" The older man did not answer. Instead, he walked toward the back of the shop, stopping in front of a massive floor-to-ceiling Victorian bookcase. Harrison reached out, grasping a leather-bound encyclopedia on the third shelf, and pulled it forward. A heavy, metallic clank echoed behind the wood. The entire bookcase silently detached from the wall, sliding smoothly along a hidden floor track to reveal a sleek, brushed steel elevator door. Elias stood frozen, his breath catching in his throat. Harrison pressed his thumb against a biometric scanner embedded in the wall. The doors parted with a soft pneumatic hiss. "Come with me," Harrison instructed. Elias stepped inside, his mind reeling as the elevator descended deep beneath the city streets. When the doors finally opened, the dusty scent of the antique shop vanished, replaced by the cool, filtered air of a state-of-the-art subterranean command center. Elias stepped out onto polished black marble. Before him stretched a massive, glass-walled corporate office, lined with glowing server racks, real-time global market monitors, and a sprawling mahogany conference table. "I am not a shop clerk, Elias," Harrison said, stepping out beside him and handing him a heavy, leather-bound dossier. "I am the chief executive of your father's estate, and this shop is a physical front for Vanguard Holdings, a private equity firm your father built entirely from shadows." Elias stared blankly at the staggering financial figures illuminating the screens. "Your father was not a poor antique dealer," Harrison continued, his voice echoing in the vast, silent room. "Silas Vance was a financial titan, and as of midnight last night, you are the sole inheritor of a $15 billion empire." The glowing monitors casting a pale blue light across the subterranean office displayed a staggering network of wealth. Elias stood frozen, his eyes darting across real-time feeds of international real estate holdings, majority stakes in tech conglomerates, and offshore accounts holding figures so large they seemed entirely fictional. Mr. Harrison walked to the center of the room, his footsteps sharp against the polished black marble, and tapped a keyboard. A massive central screen shifted, displaying the Vanguard Holdings master portfolio. $15 billion. Elias reached out, his fingertips pressing into the cool wood of the mahogany conference table, desperately grounding himself in the physical reality of the room. The father he had carried out the back door of a dinner party, the man who wore frayed cuffs and drove a rusted sedan, had secretly commanded global markets from beneath a dusty floorboard. It defied logic. It defied everything Elias thought he knew about his own existence. Harrison approached him, his demeanor entirely transformed from a humble shopkeeper to a high-level executive. He held a thick cream-colored envelope sealed with dark red wax, extending it to Elias with absolute reverence. Elias took it, his hands finally steady. He broke the seal. The heavy parchment inside bore his father's familiar, meticulous handwriting. He unfolded the pages, the profound silence of the underground room pressing heavily against his ears, and began to read. My dearest Elias, if you are reading this, then my time has passed, and Mr. Harrison has brought you into the light. I know the profound shock you are feeling. I know you are questioning why I forced you to live a life of perceived mediocrity, while I sat on a financial empire. The answer, my son, is the woman you married. Elias's breath hitched. He gripped the paper tighter. I have watched the Kensingtons for years. They are not merely high society snobs. They are financial vultures, feeding on the weak to maintain their fragile illusion of supremacy. Clara did not marry you for love. She married you because she believed you were a soft, malleable man she could easily control. If I had handed you this wealth on your wedding day, her family would have drained it, and she would have destroyed you from the inside out. I needed you to see her true face. I needed you to be pushed to your absolute lowest point, completely devoid of money and status, so you could witness exactly how she treats a man who can offer her nothing. Elias closed his eyes. The agonizing memory of Clara forbidding him to call an ambulance, demanding he drag his dying father out of sight, flashed behind his eyelids like a violent nightmare. The humiliation had not been a random tragedy. It had been a painful, necessary revelation. He opened his eyes and continued reading. The Vanguard Trust is now fully activated. You are the sole heir to everything I have built. You have the power to buy and sell the Kensingtons 10 times over. But hear me now, Elias, and heed my final instruction. Do not act in anger. Anger is loud, sloppy, and predictable. If you shout, she will play the victim. Act with absolute silent strategy. Be the ghost in her machine. Let her arrogance blind her until the very moment you pull the floor from beneath her feet. Elias slowly lowered the letter. The heavy, suffocating numbness that had paralyzed him in the hospital waiting room evaporated, instantly replaced by a terrifying, absolute clarity. The $15 billion illuminating the screens around him was not an inheritance. It was a weapon. He looked up at Mr. Harrison, his posture straightening, the grief in his eyes hardening into something cold and unbreakable. He folded the letter and placed it carefully into his breast pocket. He was no longer the broken husband begging for a shred of empathy. He was the architect of Clara's ruin, and he was going to dismantle her world piece by piece. The drive back to the house Elias shared with Clara felt like crossing the border into enemy territory. He parked his car in the circular driveway, the evening shadows stretching long and dark across the manicured lawn. He walked through the heavy front doors, the silence of the grand foyer feeling heavy and expectant. As he turned into the main living room, he found exactly what his father had warned him to expect. Clara sat elegantly on the white leather sofa, sipping sparkling water. Beside her sat Preston-Croft, his arm draped casually over the backrest, invading Elias's home with the same effortless arrogance he carried everywhere. Across from them, perched rigidly in a wing-back chair, was a man in a sharp gray suit clutching a thick leather briefcase. A lawyer. Elias stopped in the doorway. He let his shoulders slump instinctively, slipping back into the familiar, tailored skin of the inadequate husband. Clara set her glass down with a soft clink. She looked at him with a gaze that was a chilling mixture of false pity and venomous triumph. Sit down, Elias. We need to have a very difficult conversation. Elias shuffled forward, his eyes darting nervously toward the lawyer. He lowered himself onto the very edge of an armchair, radiating utter exhaustion. What is this, Clara? He asked, his voice deliberately thin and raspy. The lawyer unlatched his briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents, sliding them across the glass coffee table. Clara leaned forward, interlacing her fingers. You are not well, Elias, she said, her voice dripping with artificial concern. The trauma of last night, carrying your father out like that, right in front of everyone. You have suffered a profound psychological break. You are completely unstable. Elias stared at the papers. The top page bore the bold legal header for a petition for conservatorship and durable power of attorney. Preston chuckled softly, a cruel, grating sound. We are just looking out for your best interests. Buddy, you are in no shape to handle financial burdens right now. The funeral costs, liquidating the antique shop, your father's life insurance. It is simply too much for a man in your fragile mental state. The trap was breathtaking in its sheer, sociopathic audacity. Clara did not just want to divorce him. She wanted to erase his autonomy entirely. By declaring him legally incompetent due to grief, she would seize total control of his life. She would liquidate the shop, pocket whatever modest life insurance she assumed Silas possessed, and walk away with Preston, leaving Elias locked in a psychiatric facility or destitute on the street. A white-hot rage flared in Elias's chest, powerful enough to burn the house to its foundations. He wanted to scream. He wanted to slam his father's $15 billion portfolio onto the glass table and watch their smug, beautiful faces contort in absolute terror. But then his father's final words echoed in his mind. Do not act in anger. Act with absolute, silent strategy. Elias swallowed the fire. He let his hands tremble slightly as he reached out and touched the edge of the paperwork. He looked up at Clara, widening his eyes to show nothing but panic and broken defeat. You cannot do this, he stammered, his voice cracking perfectly. I am not crazy, Clara. Please, you are my wife. Please do not do this to me. Clara's eyes gleamed with intoxicating power. She was completely convinced of her own supremacy. She sighed, looking at Preston as if dealing with a stubborn, slow-witted child. Sign the papers, Elias. Make it easy on yourself. If you fight me, the courts will force it anyway. You have no money for a lawyer, and you have absolutely no one left to protect you. Elias pulled his trembling hands back, shaking his head weakly. I will not sign, he whispered, staring at the floor. Not today. I cannot. Clara stood up, smoothing her skirt. She looked down at him with absolute disgust, reveling in his pathetic display. Fine. Sulk in your grief for the weekend. But by Monday morning, my lawyer will file the involuntary petition, and a judge will strip you of your rights entirely. Enjoy your last few days of freedom. She walked out of the room, Preston trailing closely behind her, their low, victorious laughter echoing down the hallway. Elias remained seated, his head bowed, looking like a thoroughly conquered man. But as the front door clicked shut, the trembling in his hands vanished instantly. A cold, dangerous smile touched the corners of his mouth. The trap was set, but Clara had no idea she was the one standing blindly inside it. The descent into the subterranean office beneath the antique shop felt like crossing the threshold into another dimension. Leaving the suffocating, hostile walls of his home behind, Elias stepped out of the hidden elevator and into the cool, immaculate sanctuary of Vanguard Holdings. Mr. Harrison was already waiting, standing beside the glowing expanse of the central command table. There were no tears left, no remnants of the broken man who had cowered on the living room sofa. Elias unbuttoned his suit jacket, rolled up his sleeves, and took his seat at the head of the mahogany table. It was time to go to war. Pull up everything we have on the Kensington family, Elias commanded, his voice steady and perfectly calibrated. And I want a full, unredacted financial profile on Preston Croft. Harrison's fingers flew across the keyboard. Instantly, the massive glass screens illuminated with spreadsheets, bank records, and property deeds. What Elias saw over the next hour was nothing short of poetic justice. The Kensingtons, with their imported crystal, vintage wines, and suffocating arrogance, were living on a gilded prayer. Their entire aristocratic lifestyle was a meticulously constructed illusion. They were drowning in massive, unmanageable debt. The sprawling estate where they had let his father die was leveraged to the hilt, burdened by multiple secret mortgages. Their credit lines were overextended. Their cash flow was practically non-existent, and bankruptcy was breathing down their aristocratic necks. Preston Croft's portfolio was even more pathetic. The smug, custom-suited man who planned to steal Elias's wife, and his freedom was running a house of cards. His so-called successful businesses were hemorrhaging capital, surviving only on toxic, high-interest commercial loans that were weeks away from default. Elias leaned back in his leather chair, staring at the fragile architecture of their lives. They are bleeding out, Harrison. They just do not know it yet. What are your orders, sir? Harrison asked, his eyes sharp. By the paper, Elias said, his tone devoid of mercy. All of it. Using the staggering $15 billion liquidity of the Vanguard Trust, the quiet, surgical acquisition began. It was aggressive, rapid, and entirely invisible. Through a labyrinth of offshore shell companies and proxy firms, Vanguard Holdings systematically swept through the city's financial institutions. Elias purchased the Kensington's primary and secondary mortgages, paying off the banks in cash and transferring the deeds to Vanguard. He moved on to Preston, acquiring the controlling promissory notes and commercial debts, holding Croft's failing empire together. With a few keystrokes, Elias became their sole primary creditor. He legally owned the roofs over their heads and the very businesses they boasted about, yet his name appeared nowhere on the official documents. But Elias was not finished. "Where is Clara planning to host her triumphant charity gala this weekend?" he asked. Harrison brought up a new file. "The Grand Beaumont Pavilion. It is the most exclusive venue in the city. The Kensingtons have booked the main ballroom to announce a corporate merger with Mr. Croft, an attempt to temporarily mask their insolvency." Elias stared at the image of the opulent ballroom. "Contact the owners of the Beaumont. Offer them 20% above market value for the entire property, effective immediately, on the condition of absolute non-disclosure." By dawn, the ink was dry. Elias Vance had effectively bought the Kensington estate, Preston's companies, and the very ground Clara planned to walk upon to celebrate her victory. The noose was tied, measured, and securely fastened, waiting quietly in the dark. All Elias had to do now was let them step onto the stage. The morning of the Kensington Charity Gala arrived with a crisp, deceivingly bright sunlight that poured through the expansive windows of the marital home. Upstairs, the master suite was a whirlwind of manic, toxic energy. Clara was practically vibrating with triumph. She moved frantically between her walk-in closet and a row of open designer luggage, aggressively packing her most expensive jewelry, her silks, and her Italian shoes. This was not merely packing for a weekend getaway. This was a permanent extraction. Today was the day she was officially leaving Elias for Preston Croft. Her phone buzzed continuously with updates from her lawyer, confirming that the involuntary petition for Elias's conservatorship had just been officially filed with the county courts. In her mind, the victory was already absolute and irreversible. Clara zipped the final leather bag shut and checked the reflection in the full-length mirror. She wore a breathtaking, custom-fitted emerald gown that screamed old money and untouchable status. She looked like a queen preparing for a coronation. But before she left for the venue, she needed one final, intoxicating indulgence. She needed to look down at the man she had so thoroughly broken. She found Elias in the downstairs sunroom, sitting quietly in a high-backed armchair, bathed in the fading late-afternoon light. She stepped into the room, the heavy, suffocating scent of her expensive perfume cutting through quiet air. "I am leaving now," she announced, her voice dripping with cruel, unadulterated satisfaction. "Preston is sending a private car for me. My bags will be retrieved by his staff tomorrow." She paused, waiting for Elias to beg, to cry, to display the pathetic, crumbling desperation she so hungrily fed upon. But Elias did not move. He simply sat there, looking down at his hands. Clara scoffed, profoundly annoyed by his silence. "In case you were harboring any delusional last-minute hopes, you are explicitly uninvited from the gala tonight. Security at the Beaumont Pavilion has your photograph, and they have strict orders to throw you out if you even step foot on the property." She walked closer, her heels clicking sharply like gunfire against the hardwood floor. "My lawyer filed the paperwork an hour ago. Elias. The judge will review it first thing Monday morning. You will be quietly escorted to a psychiatric facility. Your father's worthless antique shop will be liquidated, and I will finally be completely free of the suffocating, pathetic marriage." Elias slowly lifted his head. The frantic, shattered husband she expected to see was entirely gone. In his place sat a man who looked like deep water, still, dark, and terrifyingly calm. He raised his left wrist and slowly, methodically, adjusted the worn leather strap of his father's old watch. The simple, tarnished timepiece looked wildly out of place against his tailored cuff, but Elias touched it with the reverence of a king adjusting a crown. "I understand, Clara," Elias said. His voice was not thin or raspy. It was a rich, steady baritone that resonated with strange, heavy authority. He did not sound like a man who had just lost his life and his freedom. He sounded like a judge who had just finalized an inescapable sentence. "You have made your intentions perfectly clear." Clara frowned, a sudden, inexplicable chill crawling up the back of her bare neck. His absolute lack of fear deeply unnerved her, chipping away at the very edge of her arrogant high. But she quickly shoved the feeling down, hopelessly blinded by her own manic greed. She let out a short, dismissive laugh. "Goodbye, Elias. Enjoy the quiet." Elias watched her turn and strut out of sunroom. He listened to the sharp click of her heels fading down the hallway, followed by the heavy, final thud of the front door closing. He looked down at his father's watch once more, watching the second hand sweep smoothly across the dial. The prey was gleefully walking straight toward the slaughter. Elias stood up, smoothing his jacket, and softly wished her a good evening to the empty room. He knew, with absolute certainty, it would be the very last good evening of her aristocratic life. The Grand Beaumont Pavilion was a symphony of extravagant excess. The sprawling ballroom was lined with towering gold-leaf pillars and illuminated by a dozen cascading crystal chandeliers that threw fractured light across the polished marble floors. The air inside was thick with the scent of imported orchids and million-dollar perfumes. Waitstaff in crisp white tuxedos navigated a sea of silk, velvet, and bespoke tailoring, carrying silver trays heavily loaded with beluga caviar and vintage champagne. This was the undisputed epicenter of the city's elite, a fortress of old money and untouchable privilege. And tonight, the Kensingtons were the undisputed royalty of the room. Clara floated to the crowd like a conquering empress. She was a vision of calculated perfection, draped in her emerald gown and dripping with a diamond necklace that practically blinded anyone who looked her way. But she was not walking alone. Her arm was looped firmly and proudly through Preston Crofts. They moved together with the undeniable, shameless intimacy of a couple who had completely stopped pretending. To the casual observer, it was scandalous, but Clara knew exactly how to spin the narrative in a room like this. Whenever she caught the eye of a high society wife or a wealthy socialite, Clara would lean in close, lowering her voice into a practiced, sorrowful whisper. She spun a tragic, devastating tale about her absent husband. She whispered that the sudden death of Silas had completely broken Elias, that he had suffered a violent psychological collapse, and that for her own safety, she had been forced to step away. "He has simply lost his mind," she murmured to the mayor's wife, pressing a manicured hand to her chest with a heavy sigh. "It is a tragedy, of course, but one must survive." The women would gasp, nod with fierce sympathy, and immediately accept Preston as her wealthy, heroic protector. The lie spread to the ballroom like a sweet, toxic perfume. As the evening reached a fever pitch of laughter and indulgence, the string quartet gracefully faded into silence. A sharp, commanding ringing echoed to the hall as Clara's father, Arthur Kensington, tapped a silver spoon against his crystal champagne flute. He stood at the center of the grand stage, bathed in a warm, dramatic spotlight. He looked every inch the untouchable patriarch, his chest puffed out with arrogant pride, soaking in the absolute attention of his peers. Arthur raised his hands, his voice booming over the state-of-the-art sound system, oozing with supreme confidence. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we are not just gathered for a charitable cause. We are here to witness the dawn of a new era. The Kensington family has always stood at the absolute pinnacle of the city's industry, but tonight we are expanding our legacy." He gestured grandly toward the floor, where Clara and Preston stood beaming in the front row. "It is with immense pride that I officially announce a corporate merger between Kensington Enterprises and Croft Holdings. Together, we are creating an unstoppable financial dynasty that will dominate this market for generations to come." The ballroom erupted into deafening applause. Clara leaned her head against Preston's shoulder, a smile of intoxicating victory plastered across her face. They were standing at the absolute peak of their false mountain. They believed this merger would inject them with enough capital to outrun their hidden bankruptcy. They believed they had won. The elite crowd raised their crystal glasses high into the air, toasting to their brilliant future, completely and utterly blind to the fact that the man they had thrown away now owned the stage, the building, and every single drop of champagne they were currently swallowing. The deafening applause echoing through the Grand Beaumont Pavilion was suddenly, violently severed. At the far end of the ballroom, the massive, 12-foot mahogany double doors swung open with a heavy, resounding thud that rattled the nearby crystal champagne towers. The room collectively held its breath, turning toward the entrance. Stepping across the threshold was not the broken, grief-stricken man the high society wives had just been whispering about. It was Elias Vance. But the off-the-rack navy suit was gone, replaced by a flawless midnight blue bespoke tuxedo that draped him in an aura of untouchable, terrifying authority. He did not look like a charity case. He looked like a king who had finally come to claim his throne. Flanking him was Mr. Harrison, his posture rigid and commanding, accompanied by a phalanx of elite corporate attorneys carrying sleek, black leather briefcases. The sea of silk and velvet parted instantly. The elite guests instinctively stepped back, carving a wide, silent path down the center of the room. Clara's triumphant smile froze, then shattered. Her emerald gown suddenly seemed too heavy, her diamond necklace too tight. Preston Croft dropped his champagne flute. It shattered against the marble floor, the sharp crack echoing in the dead silence. Elias did not look at his wife. He kept his eyes locked on the stage, his strides long and measured. He ascended the velvet-lined stairs with the calm inevitability of a ticking clock. Arthur Kensington, his face flushed red with indignation, stepped forward. What is the meaning of this? Security removed this man. Elias simply reached out and took the microphone from Arthur's trembling hand. He did it with such cold, effortless dominance that the older man stumbled backward, completely disarmed. Elias turned to face the glittering, breathless crowd. When he spoke, his voice was a deep, resonant baritone that commanded every atom of air in the pavilion. Arthur Kensington just spoke to you about a new era. Elias began, his tone devoid of any emotion, and on that single point he is entirely correct. However, there will be no merger tonight. You cannot merge two empires that no longer exist. Murmurs of confusion rippled through the elite audience. Clara gripped Preston's arm, her face draining of color. My name is Elias Vance, he continued, his voice echoing off the gold-leaf pillars. I am the sole inheritor and chairman of Vanguard Holdings, a $15 billion private equity firm built by my late father, Silas. Over the past 48 hours, Vanguard has aggressively acquired all outstanding commercial and private debts belonging to both the Kensington family and Preston Croft. Elias paused, letting the sheer magnitude of the statement settle over the room. I legally own your estates. I own your holding companies. And as of yesterday evening, I own this very pavilion. Gasps erupted from the front rows. Arthur clutched his chest, staggering against the podium. Elias finally turned his gaze down to Clara. She looked small, terrified, and entirely ruined. My wife, Elias said, the word dripping with icy disdain, spent her morning filing legal petitions to have me declared mentally incompetent, hoping to seize my modest assets and elope a man who is currently drowning in toxic debt. She believed I was a broken, powerless fool. Elias stepped closer to the edge of the stage, his voice hardening into steel. But her true sin was not infidelity, nor was it greed. Last week, when my father suffered a fatal heart attack at her family's dinner table, Clara and her parents explicitly forbade me from calling an ambulance. They demanded I drag my dying father out the back door so his medical emergency would not ruin their ambience. A collective wave of absolute horror swept through the guests. Socialites covered their mouths. Businessmen stared at the Kensingtons with profound disgust. The aristocratic illusion was completely obliterated. Elias looked out over the crowd one last time, delivering his final, inescapable verdict. As your primary creditor, I am foreclosing on your homes, and I am liquidating your businesses, effective immediately. Your accounts are frozen. The Kensington legacy ends tonight. The silence that followed Elias's declaration was absolute, broken only by the sound of Arthur Kensington collapsing heavily into a gilded chair. The untouchable patriarch buried his face in his trembling hands, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps as the terrifying reality of his total financial ruin finally set in. Preston Croft, the arrogant, custom-suited savior, backed away slowly. He looked at Clara not with love, but with sheer, unadulterated panic, realizing he had just tied his sinking ship to a massive, plunging anchor. Clara was shaking uncontrollably. The emerald gown, the blinding diamonds, the perfectly styled hair, all the impenetrable armor of her aristocratic life shattered into dust. The city's elite, the very people whose approval she valued above oxygen itself, were staring at her with cold, merciless judgment. They were already stepping backward, physically distancing themselves from the contagious, toxic stench of bankruptcy and public scandal. Unable to support her own weight, Clara's knees buckled. She collapsed onto the polished marble floor, right at the edge of the stage. For the first time in her deeply calculated life, the tears spilling down her cheeks were entirely real. They were hot, desperate tears of absolute terror. She looked up at Elias, her makeup running, her hands reaching out to frantically grasp the hem of his dark trousers. "Elias, please," she sobbed, her voice a raw, pathetic wail that echoed through the stunned ballroom. "Please, you cannot do this. I am your wife. I love you. I have always loved you. It was my parents. It was Preston. They pressured me into it. Please, Elias. I made a terrible mistake." Elias looked down at the woman who had tormented him for years. He felt no anger, no pity, and no lingering attachment. He felt only the profound, cleansing weight of ultimate justice. He slowly reached down and gently removed her manicured fingers from his suit. He leaned forward, his voice perfectly level, carrying effortlessly over her frantic sobs. "Stop this immediately, Clara," he said, his word a chilling, precise echo of the night his father died. "You are making a scene, and I will not have you ruin the ambience of my evening." Clara gasped, the breath violently knocked out of her as the cruelty of her own words was handed directly back to her. Elias did not wait for a response. He straightened his posture, turned his back on the Kensingtons, and walked gracefully down the center aisle of the Grand Pavilion. Mr. Harrison and the legal team followed closely behind. The heavy mahogany doors swung shut, leaving Clara kneeling in the spectacular wreckage of her own arrogance, possessing absolutely nothing. Hours later, the chaos of the gala had faded into the quiet, peaceful stillness of the early morning. Elias stood alone inside the dusty, cluttered sanctuary of the antique shop. The heavy scent of beeswax and old paper wrapped around him like a familiar, comforting embrace. He walked behind a scarred wooden counter and picked up a small, silver-framed photograph of Silas. His father was smiling that gentle, knowing smile. Elias traced the edge of the frame, the metallic coolness grounding him. The war was over. The $15 billion empire was no longer just a weapon of retribution. It was a powerful, enduring foundation. He looked out through the glass storefront at the waking city, ready to use Vanguard holdings not for power, but for profound purpose. He would build a legacy his father intended, one defined by quiet strength, true dignity, and unshakable honor. If you enjoyed this story of justice and legacy, please hit the like button, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more stories. Thank you for watching.